Greetings, my name is Jeff Smith, minister for the Haymarket Church of Christ. This is our Bible lesson for June 14th. This is our 11th in a series of 13 lessons on the Gospel of Mark, and today we'll consider chapter 14. Only 3 times in the study did we consider more than one chapter at a time. These last 3 lessons will be one chapter at a time, although chapter 14 is pretty long. There's a lot of material in here as we get close to the end of our study. By way of review, the Gospel of Mark is the earliest of the Gospel accounts. It is concise and fast-paced. It is very vivid in what it's relating, and it is evangelistic. It leads us to understand who Jesus is and to do something about it. The macro outline for this book is as follows. After an introduction and a preparation for Jesus' ministry in the first chapter, we proceed with the Galilean ministry, chapters 1 through 9. Then we follow Jesus on his journey to Jerusalem in chapter 10, the ministry there in Jerusalem, chapters 11 through 13, the suffering and death of Jesus in Jerusalem, chapters 14 and 15, his resurrection and appearances, and then the Great Commission in chapter 16. And so this study, chapter 14, is the first part of the account of his suffering and death, often referred to as his passion. These events are taking place in the city of Jerusalem and just outside of it, also in Bethany, which is not pictured here. But this is the artist's rendering of what the city layout was at the time. As I said, chapter 14 is pretty long, 72 verses, and in it, the micro outline, we're going to see the leaders plotting to kill Jesus and bringing that plot to fruition in these next couple of chapters. Jesus would then be anointed at Bethany by Mary. We see Judas identified as the betrayer. Then at the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper is instituted and Peter's denial is foretold. Then they go out to Gethsemane and there Jesus prays and then is arrested after the betrayal by Judas Iscariot. All his disciples flee, and lastly, a young man flees naked, verses 51 and 52. Then we see him before the council under the direction of Caiaphas, and then as part of that, we get a glimpse of Peter denying Jesus. So those are all the things we cover in chapter 14. Chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, the leaders are plotting to kill Jesus. It was identified as 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they were concerned about the people, so they were looking for a way to privately seize him. The Jewish leaders resisting and challenging Jesus is not a new thing. They had been doing this from the beginning, especially back in chapters 2 and 3. We see that detailed in a lot of detail by Mark as Jesus healed a paralyzed man and forgiving his sins. They accused him of blasphemy, and that's interesting because the blasphemy charge is what they're going to ultimately convict him of and say justifies his execution. When he is eating with the tax collectors in chapter 2 verse 16, they accuse him of eating with sinners. When he and his disciples are eating grain on the Sabbath, they accuse him of violating the Sabbath in chapter 2, verse 24. Then in chapter 3, verse 6, as he healed a man with a withered hand, he did that almost in their face, so to speak. He knew that they were against it, but he did it anyway. And so they really didn't challenge him at that point, but at that point it says that they from then on sought to destroy him. So even from the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark, the Jewish leaders had resisted and challenged what Jesus was doing. And so this is just getting to be the fulfillment of what they had purposed right along. As Jesus is in the house of Simon the leper in Bethany, reclining at a table, a woman came, and John tells us that who these other players were in this section. John informs us that it was Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who anointed Jesus on this occasion with this very expensive ointment. And it was Judas Iscariot who did the complaining. Mark tells the story without relating exactly who it was, but very expensive ointment was put on Jesus, on his head, and some indignantly objected and said this could have been given to the poor. But Jesus, they were giving her a hard time. It says in Mark that they scolded her, verse 5, the last part. But Jesus defended her. Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. You always have the poor with you. Whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So Jesus defends her. She's trying to do something nice, and she's getting trouble from the rest of the disciples, kind of fulfillment of that adage that says no good deed goes unpunished. But Jesus rises to her defense and says she's doing a good thing. And Jesus wasn't saying that it's more important to help him than to help the poor. He's just saying that there was a difference in timing here. You could help the poor at any time, but it was more urgent if you're going to do something nice for him while he was in his earthly ministry, for he was just about done with that. And so she was doing something nice for him while she could, and she was defended for that. We saw in verses 1 and 2 that the Pharisees were seeking an opportunity to seize Jesus in a private way so that the crowds wouldn't object. And now we see that Judas Iscariot is seeking a way to betray Jesus. And so these two entities hook up and get their plan together for how they might betray Jesus. Mark 14, beginning in verse 12, the Passover with the disciples, the Last Supper, you could say. It was the first day of the unleavened bread when they sacrificed the Passover lamb. Mark is very specific about the timing there. And the first thing that needs to be arranged is where this is going to take place. And so a very unusual plan. Jesus says, go look for a man carrying a jar of water. And when you meet him, follow him and go in there. There's going to be a large upper room that's already furnished and ready, and you'll have access to that. And so the disciples set out, and they go to the city, and they find it just as Jesus said they would, and that's where they prepare. Verse 17, when it was evening, he came with the 12, and they were reclining at the table. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. And so they start to wonder who it is. And he said that he would signify that by dipping simultaneously into the dish when the one who was going to betray him was doing it. And he says that even though Jesus, as part of God's plan, needed to be betrayed, verse 21, for the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man had he not been born. And so the consequences for Judas' betrayal fall upon him, and he has to give account for that. But he institutes the Lord's Supper in verse 22. As they were eating, he took the bread, and after blessing it, broke it, gave it to them, and said, take, this is my body. And he took a cup. When he had given thanks for it, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. And so verses 12 through 25, he has the supper with the disciples and institutes what we call the Lord's Supper. In verse 26, when they had sung a hymn, and we notice that they sang, we find record of people singing in the New Testament, even here the Lord and the disciples singing. We don't find record here of any instrumental accompaniment to that. They sang. And then they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I'll go before you to Galilee." And very plainly, Jesus talks about a real unfortunate instance, I think, where all the disciples were going to turn away. Peter says, no, that's not going to happen. Even though they all fall away, I will not, in verse 29. But Jesus says to him clearly, "Truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. This is an amazing discrepancy. Jesus said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to deny me. Everybody's going to deny me. And Peter says, absolutely not. And so they really are not lined up here with what's going to happen, diametrically opposed even with who's going to be true to Jesus. Jesus then goes to the Garden of Gethsemane with the disciples in tow. And it's interesting how they proceed from here. Judas has already gone away at this time to do the betrayal, to get the group and to lead them back. So Jesus is there with 11 of his disciples. They all enter the garden, but then they go further in, just Jesus with Peter, James, and John. And after they go a little bit further, then Jesus separates from Peter, James, and John and goes on and is just alone. And he prays there. He said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet, not what I will, but what you will." And he comes back to the group, Peter, James, and John, and finds them asleep. And is disappointed, it seems, that they couldn't watch 1 hour. I think this speaks to their being emotionally drained and being physically weak by all that they're going through. And he says, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak, which could explain not only what happens here in the garden, but then also the betrayal afterwards. And it happens a second time, and then a third time. And then in verse 42, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." The betrayal and arrest is accounted here recounted for us, verses 43 through 50. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man." The problem for the people that were going to seize him is, how do they know they get the right one? So there has to be a way to identify him. And I believe it's in John's gospel that Jesus objects to that, or remarks that Judas would use that symbol of intimacy, of love, a kiss, a symbol of respect, and use that to betray him. It's just very ironic that that would be the way that he would do that. So they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest on the ear. Again, Mark doesn't tell us that it's Peter who does this, and Malchus is the name of the servant. But Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And so you could see that nothing in his public ministry warranted this kind of pursuit and this kind of treatment. But this is how they did it. And he acquiesces and says, "So let the scriptures be fulfilled." And it says in verse 50, they all left him and they all fled. And all flee, including a young man who was following him, not named. But he was in nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, and he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. And so a very figurative account here of how there was no honor in the way that these people fled from being with Jesus. Beginning in verse 53, Jesus is before the council. They led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. That sets up that scenario. Now, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. And that speaks volumes too, doesn't it? Everyone who was witnessing what he had done in his ministry couldn't come up with anything that was really worthy of any kind of punishment. But then many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.'" And so that's a prophecy that was made, but to take it literally is to miss the point of that. But it says in verse 59, even about this testimony, it did not agree. Well, then the high priest stood up in the midst of and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent and he made no answer. We refer to this as kind of a kangaroo court anyway. This was not about seeing justice done. This was about getting their agenda served. And then the high priest asked him clearly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." This is, in all the gospel accounts, one of the clearest admissions that Jesus makes about who he is. He says, "Yes, I am the Christ, the Son of the Blessed," which he's been saying and demonstrating right along. But here he just says it very, very plainly. And it's true. He is. But he gets in trouble because they don't agree with what he has just said. In verse 63, the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard this blasphemy." So recall this slide from earlier where we had seen them in chapters 2 and 3 resisting his ministry and his teaching. And they had accused him of blasphemy back then. Now they formally accuse him of blasphemy here in chapter 14, verse 62. And going back to the book of Numbers, at least according to the New American Standard Translation, a person who does anything defiantly, whether he is native or alien, that one is blaspheming the Lord. That person shall be cut up from among his people. And so if they understood that you had committed blasphemy, that was something worthy of death. And so this is where they find the justification for their leading him away to be crucified. In verse 64, they all condemned him as deserving of death. In verse 65, some real ugliness here. Some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." And the guards received him with blows. And so he's getting beat up. He's being dishonored here, being spat upon at this point. Peter was below in the courtyard. And so simultaneously with what's happening to Jesus, Peter outside, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, seeing Peter warming himself. She looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene, Jesus." But he denied it. And of course, this goes on for 3 different times, as Jesus said. And then the rooster crowed a second time. And then Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. He realizes that he had done it exactly as Jesus said. And so the amazing discrepancy, even though Peter had been told clearly what was going to happen, he denied it, and he said that absolutely will not happen. But it did happen. He did not have the strength within himself to stay committed to Jesus even as this was coming upon them. So a very, very sad time for him. He broke down and wept because he did not intend to let the Lord down. He intended to stay faithful, but he was not able. As he said before, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, as they said in the garden. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 14, halfway through the account of Jesus' betrayal and arrest and crucifixion. We'll finish that with chapter 15 next time, a week from today. We're glad that you joined us for this. Hope it's been of help. We invite you to come and join us again via this recording or one like it, or come and worship with us at Haymarket Church of Christ, 6945 Gillis Way in Gainesville, Virginia. God bless.